Okay, good morning, guys. This is Mrs. Shanaki giving you a presentation on our upcoming unit. So we are moving away from World War One, and we're going into our next unit. I call it 6.5 because we're not quite at our last unit yet. This is a little in-between unit, and it's called American Dream or Delusion. It's going to be part one of this. And so what we're looking at within this module is the Roaring 20s all the way up to the Great Depression. So, about a decade span of history. What we're talking about specifically today is going to be post World War I America, in addition to society and culture in the 1920s. This is all we're focusing on this week. Next week, we have spring break. And then the week following that, we'll start digging into the Great Depression, where we can finish up this mini unit, this part one of American Dream or Delusion. Now, throughout this whole presentation, I will have vocabulary words, but I also have those vocabulary words linked on our weekly schedule. Now, what's really important is we're only going to cover about half of the vocabulary words today. When we return from spring break, we will cover the other half of vocabulary words that are more related to the Great Depression and the second half of this decade that we're looking at. What you can expect is on April 17th, we will be having a vocabulary test on Canvas, very similar to ones that we've had in the past, so nothing new specifically, but that will be your assessment. So your goal today is to be taking notes on this content so that you can better use your vocabulary terms. It will be a combination of both multiple choice, but I will be asking you as well to do some short answer responses. So you'll have to know how to use the vocabulary terms in the context of history in order to get full points on those questions. So to start us off, we're going to talk about post World War I America. So again, like I said, take some notes on this content. Try to especially take notes as the history relates to the vocabulary terms that we'll be talking about today. And I hope you enjoy. This is a really fantastic decade that we're going to be looking at. Everybody loves the Roaring 20s. We're in the 2020s now, and so we're exactly 100 years after this point in time, which makes the history a little exciting. So post World War I America. Vocabulary terms that we are focusing on here are going to be nativism and isolationism. Those should not be new words. Those are actually repeat words from our immigration unit. And then we're also adding in communism and anarchist. Okay, so to really start talking about how America was following World War I, people in America struggled. There was a lot of political arguments. There were a lot of feelings of unsureness of what the future held. And America debated about really important things such as the League of Nations. You guys read about this last week when I had you look at the Treaty of Versailles. And Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points, one of which included a group of nations that would maintain world peace. And America ultimately does not join the League of Nations, which is almost ironic because it was really President Woodrow Wilson's idea to develop it all, and yet we stay behind. We do not join. We do later join the United Nations, which is going to be like the younger brother or sister of the League of Nations. But ultimately, America really struggles with their place in the world following World War I. Our economy also struggles a little bit. So, returning soldiers, they want their jobs back. That makes sense. They fought in the war. Now they're coming home to the United States, and they kind of want to pick up where they left off. But unfortunately, this displaces many women and minorities who had had the opportunity to take those jobs during World War I. And so not only do you have a workforce returning, but you also have people who had received opportunities they might not have gotten before being once again kicked out of those positions. And so that adds to our economic struggles. The cost of living doubles since before the war, and so prices in itself are just completely fluctuating. They're growing. We have farmers and factories that really suffer at this point in time because the wartime orders, the food that was necessary to feed soldiers, the equipment that was necessary to send us to war, those orders aren't coming in anymore. There's no war to supply. And so many farmers who had bought extra land for the war so they could produce more food, or factories that had expanded their ability to make products, that just isn't happening after the war. And so many businesses struggle readjusting to a peacetime economy. So, how America deals with this is through the ideas of nativism and isolationism. So, again, these are not new terms. We've actually already taken a look at these two terms. America tends to become very focused inward when we have problems outside of our control. And so, what this looks like. Okay, so we have Americans react to economic and political struggle. So, just as a recap, nativism, it means that you're prejudiced against foreign born people. So, you want to focus on those who are born in America. They are considered the air quote best. And then we have isolationism, which is moving away from world affairs. After World War I, America's not interested whatsoever in world affairs. We feel following World War I that we just got too involved with European problems and that we really suffered from that. And so, as a result of this, we really start to close our doors. What this leads to, unfortunately, is a rise in the KKK. So, this idea that people who are living in America are better, there's this level of superiority against specifically immigrants, but also other minorities such as African Americans. And yes, if you're taking a look at this picture, that is the US Capitol. Okay, this happened in the 1920s. The KKK actually had a massive march in Washington, D.C., in the US Capitol. And so it maybe makes you start to question how accepted these ideas and values of nativism were at the time. What it also does is it starts to put in immigration quotas. And so if we take a look at this little political picture down here, we have all of these people coming in from Europe, and then we have Uncle Sam. He's got a little 3% card, and then he's closing the gate. And so, just like we discussed in our immigration unit, there are many times in US history where we put quotas on how many of certain groups of people we would allow into the United States. So, 5% of the people moving could be German. 5% could be Irish, 3% could be Italian, and so on. And so, with this idea of isolationism, we don't necessarily want, at this point in time, immigrants from Europe coming to the United States. We have this idea that Europe has caused a lot of problems. We got involved with those problems. And now we just want to focus on the United States and the Americans who are here right now. And so this really starts to close off open mindedness towards other cultures, other people. And we don't want really anything to do with Europe. We don't want anything to do with massive, massive immigration numbers coming in. What this also has an effect on for political and economic concerns after World War I. So we talked about the people side. Now we're going to kind of continue on the political side of this. Is this rise in fear with communism, oddly enough. And so a lot of times, if you have any brief history of the United States kind of floating in your brain, you've heard of communism. And we often think of communism most closely tied with Russia. And then we also think of communism being most closely tied with events like the Cold War, things that are going to be happening in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. Not often do we think about it in the 1920s. And really, this is the first rise of communism around the world, but also within America. So, our vocabulary term on this page, we have communism. It's an economic and political system based on a single party government ruled by a dictator. Okay, so I've got this nice poster on the side here of Uncle Sam in his war, almost soldier outfit. And the sign says, "We'll never change the blue and white to red." And so communism is most often associated with red. It's the color that we use to describe it. We'll have events in history that are called the Red Scare, which means that people were simply nervous of the spread of communism. And we also see Uncle Sam. He's standing over a flag of anarchy. And so this is also going to tie into the anarchists that I'll talk about here in just a second. What Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels have created is the Communist Manifesto. So, this is a book that really lays out the groundwork for what communism is and should be. And so, right here, I've got a nice picture of Karl Marx on the side. And what the book really talks about is that there are the haves and the have nots. So the people that had everything that they wanted in life, they had, the products, they had the money, they had the political and social status. And then on the other flip side, you have the nots, right? So people who were lacking money, people who maybe were poor, people who struggled through life, or were really always kind of downcast. And so another way to look at this from Karl Marx's perspective was the laborers versus the capitalists, those who are doing all of the work and those who really rein in the product of all that work. And Karl Marx believed that the class who had economic power also had social and political power. And so, what communism tried to do, especially the beginning concept of communism, was this idea that laborers, those who are putting in all of the work, that they would be the ones to rise up and challenge capitalists, challenge those who were in charge of them, whether that be the government or big businesses. And ultimately, if the laborers rose up, that they would be in charge of not only the economic power of their country, but also the social and political power. And so it really has this mindset of you are doing something for the better good of everybody. There wouldn't be these massive social classes. And so that's where we get this single party government ruled by a dictator. So, how does this relate to America? Because this is taking place in Russia. This is taking place in other parts of the world following World War I. People want to start testing out different political structures because they feel the monarchies and the setup of what European classes looked like before this. That's what led us to World War I. And so, how this relates to America, what we have is there's actually a growing communist community in America around this point in time. Over 70,000 people join the Communist Party within America, but the group is seen as really being quite radical, right? Remember, radical means extreme. And so, in some cases, we have events in which bombs are being sent to government buildings. This party is, again, very extreme. And so, many Americans start to begin to fear communism. They really see this as quite negative, and they very much question the ideals of communism. And it's very much against American culture to be anti-capitalist anyway. And so many people in America are very much against communism. Other groups that developed during this time, this is one of our vocabulary words, is we have the anarchists. And so this is a group of people who oppose any type of government. They don't want any institution of government that's telling them what they can and cannot do. And so this is a bit more wild than communism because it has zero structure. Anarchy is a way to describe chaos. And so people who did not want any type of government, they didn't want a leader. They didn't want an institution telling them what to do. And so this is a very, very extreme, radical group as well. And so the government at this point in time, they're trying to prevent the spread of both communism and the group of anarchists that are trying to rise up. So that's our look at post World War I America, specifically politics. Now, maybe some of the more fun topics. We have society and culture in the 1920s. I love talking about society and culture in the 1920s. So to try to like start this off, of course, we have a vocabulary at the top. So our vocabulary, the second half of our vocabulary in this presentation is going to include flapper, prohibition, speakeasy, bootlegger, and the Harlem Renaissance. So really what society and culture looks like in America following World War One at the start of the 1920s and going into really the next decade until we hit the Great Depression. To begin with, the standard of living soars in America, meaning that people are living better than they were at any other point in time in history in America. For example, 80% of the world's automobiles, so cars, are owned by Americans. 80% of the entire world's cars are here in America. Okay. Even average families can own appliances, new appliances that are coming out at this time, things like washing machines or sewing machines or vacuum cleaners. Again, we sometimes think of these appliances coming out in the 50s, where you have the typical wife at home that's doing all of the housework. But these appliances were coming out in the 1920s. And the fact is that most Americans could actually afford them. The reason for this is many of them are purchasing them on, that went away. Many of them are purchasing them on what's called credit. So we're really familiar with credit these days. We have credit cards. We know that we can go out and potentially get a car, and we don't have to pay for that entire car that day. Like we have car payments, or maybe your parents have housing payments. All of that is putting something on credit, meaning that you don't have all of the money right now, but you're able to get the item that you want and you just pay for it as time goes by. This is a totally new concept at this point in time, but that's what allows all of these Americans to have really new and fun products. So we've got our little Model T that's coming out at this point in time. All right. Then we have the Roaring Twenties. So the Roaring Twenties, the city life is just exploding at this point in time. Like during the Industrial Revolution, millions of Americans are moving to the city. And we've already looked at this. We've already discussed what the cause and effects of this are. But city life at this point in time is maybe more exciting, maybe more wild than what we previously looked at, where we were studying the tenements and the effects of the Industrial Revolution. City life in the 1920s, it's fast paced. It's the most modern culture that people are being exposed to at this point in time. There's drinking, there's partying, there's entertainment such as movies that are coming out at this point in time. And this whole atmosphere really encourages a relaxing of morals, meaning that a lot of people after the war are questioning some of these old fashioned values. Things like you really shouldn't casually date. You know, if you're going to date somebody, that's going to be the person that you're going to marry. If you're going to have a relationship with somebody, then you better be serious about it. Whereas now we have this relaxing of morals where people are going out and they're experimenting and they're casually dating and they're drinking in public and they're partying and they're having fun. This is seen as really wild behavior, and we still see in small town America this not happening. Okay, we definitely, there's a huge difference between life in the city in the 1920s and what is acceptable versus life in small town America and some of these old fashioned values of courting, values of abstaining from alcohol. Really, there aren't many opportunities for entertainment in small town America. It's not as developed. And so there isn't going to be this wild excitement for things such as movies or theaters and dancing. And so we really see a contrast. But the Roaring Twenties, it's wild, it's fun, and there's music and there's a whole new culture growing out of this point in time. So, for example, one of the biggest cultural changes comes from women at this point in time. And so, what we're going to take a look at here is are the flappers of the 1920s. So, after the war, women really began to assert their independence. And just as I mentioned before, a lot of these values of the 19th century are starting to be questioned, even rejected at points in time. I want to be really clear about the flapper, okay? So the flapper is not all women in the 1920s. You could probably maybe pinpoint more exactly a flapper as being a young woman, teenager, maybe all the way up to 30s, that's really taking on this identity. This is not going to be a blanket term for all women in the 1920s because not all women really embraced this newfound identity after World War One. But you can definitely bet that there are going to be more flappers in places like the city as opposed to small town America. So, what is a flapper? Typically, it's a term to describe a young woman, like I said, who's really embracing these new fashions and these urban attitudes. So, these city values of the day. Some characteristics that you can use to describe a flapper or maybe point one out. They have waistless, short dresses. So, if you take a look at this picture over here, I know that doesn't seem too short, but guys, this is only like an inch above the knee or an inch below the knee. This is shocking at this point in time. And we actually have skin tone stockings, okay, giving this allure that you are almost showing bare legs and a great deal of leg at that. And we have waistless dresses. So no longer are they wearing corsets that are tight and very conforming. Now we have this new identity that is loose and it's relaxed and it's less feminine in that the waistlines are much lower. And so it gives them this freedom in not only movement, but really their identity. We have high heels that they're wearing. Often they're going to have strings of beads. We can kind of see here we've got some necklaces that are hanging down really long, and they're also going to be sporting chopped boyish haircuts. And so this is once again another way that they're more or less challenging the identity of what women should be and should look like. They're cutting their hair and they're making things easier for themselves, and it's shocking and it's new. At this point in time, we know that we just passed the amendment for women's suffrage, so women can now vote, but they wanted more equality than just that. Equality didn't necessarily mean political equality at this point in time. Equality meant that women could be just as assertive or in charge as men. They embraced their sexuality. They were casually dating. They really honed in on a sense of independence, that they didn't need everything that people have been telling them that they needed before the war. Some women didn't need the institution of marriage. It's still valued, don't get me wrong, but many women suddenly are trying to discover themselves first and then move on with their lives. And so this also includes doing things in public that maybe were really frowned upon before. Things like smoking cigarettes or publicly drinking. Again, challenging the identity of what women used to be and really honing into this new sense of freedom, whether it be through their clothing, their haircuts, or their personalities. Out of World War One, we also have a group called the Lost Generation. And so this isn't a vocabulary term, but you guys are going to be looking at the Lost Generation on Tuesday as well as on Wednesday this week. And they're a really fascinating group. So I like to spend just a little time talking about them. The lost generation, it refers to a group or a generation who came of age during World War I and into the 20s. And so these were people who were maybe teenagers at the start of the war. Maybe many of them had even served in the war, but they come of age, meaning that they become young adults at the beginning of the 1920s. And the war, whether they served in the war or they were just tied to it, it made them face unimaginable horrors. When you think of the injuries of men coming home that they would have seen, you would have had people who suffered from mustard gas poisoning, people who suffered from shell explosions. Even those who had served in the war are really dealing with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, or it was called shell shock then. And after the war, they really start to question life. Why live by certain rules? What are we living for? What was the point of the war? They really have a hard time coping with just the mass amount of death and destruction that World War I had caused really at the beginning of their adult life. And so this creates a group of what we see now as very famous artists and writers. People like Ernest Hemingway are part of the lost generation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, that wrote The Great Gatsby, is part of the lost generation. Pablo Picasso, he's not really part of the lost generation, but he hangs out with this entire group of people. So we still include him. So Picasso is even part of this group that really starts to question and try to come to terms with life after the war. So again, you guys are going to be looking at them more closely on Tuesday and Wednesday this week, but they're a fascinating group of people. All right, as for general society and culture, I wanted to put a slide in here about popular culture because really for the first time, this is when we start to have popular culture. For example, the radio comes of age. And so people are tuning into radio shows and they're listening to news at a much quicker rate because it's simply available. And again, remember, people at this point in time can actually afford things like the radio or things like cars, all of these products that are brand new. We also see a rise in the love of sports, specifically America's pastime, baseball. And so I've got a little video over here of Babe Ruth hitting a home run. And so sports are something that Americans love at this point in time. A lot of post World War I America is all about entertainment, all about how do you live life to the fullest. Okay. We also have movies that inspire a strong desire for entertainment. And so in the corner here, I've got a very famous actor, Charlie Chaplin. He starred in many silent films. He was a comedian of sorts. And so we can kind of see the goofy gif that I have replaying. But popular culture was widely surrounding entertainment. All right, and then this is something you guys are going to be looking at on Friday, but we also have the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance, it comes as a result from the Great Migration. The Great Migration refers to this time in history where many African Americans were moving away from the South, removing themselves from really that history and that social structure that kept them oppressed, and they're moving north. Many are moving for job opportunities. Many are moving to start a new life. Many are moving because they hear of maybe more opportunities being available for them in the North, as opposed to the what will be soon becoming Jim Crow South. And so, for example, many of these African Americans, many of them moved to a place in the Upper West Side of New York known as Harlem. And Harlem actually becomes the world's largest Black urban community in the world. And so from this movement and this growing community, we have what is known today as the Harlem Renaissance. And it refers to really a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. So you guys are going to look more in depth on Friday at this Harlem Renaissance. But ultimately, the goals of this Renaissance was it challenged stereotypical ideas of African Americans. Here we have a middle class, highly educated group of African Americans who are creators. They are writing plays, they are writing music, they are writing books and playwrights, and we have theater that's really bursting at this point in time. And it's just this amazing moment of artistic ability that challenges what people thought of African American culture before this point in time. We'll see a growth in, for example, jazz that really spurts out of places in Harlem. And what this tries to do is it tries to push for a further acceptance in mainstream culture. Okay, an acceptance of the African American identity, also coming to terms with being an American identity. All right, so now we've got Prohibition. Yep, we've been talking about it, and it finally happens 1920 to 1933. And so this is passed with the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment basically says no drinking alcohol, no making alcohol, and no selling alcohol. And so Prohibition, it's mainly supported by religious groups in the southern and western territories of the United States. There are certainly larger groups in bigger cities, such as New York, that challenge challenge prohibition, partly because many Americans felt two things. One, they felt like they had given up a lot during World War One, that they had sacrificed a couple years of living well to focus on their country going to war. And they weren't really in the mood to give up something that they found pleasurable, such as alcohol. But also, we have still a massive population of immigrants within the United States. And for many immigrants, drinking wasn't a sin. Drinking was something that people did as a social thing, that they talked over drinks, that they connected over drinks. It wasn't seen as something that was bad or negative within moderation. And so there's really a lot of people that struggle with the idea of prohibition just as much as there are people who believe that it is the answer to solving a lot of problems within the United States. So, what did Americans do about this? Okay, I've got a nice picture in the corner here of prohibition agents dumping wine or dumping beer down the drain, right? You had to dispose of all alcohol. So, what did Americans do? Well, they combat prohibition, right? And so this is where we have our next vocabulary term, things such as speakeasy. So speakeasies, they were a place where alcoholic beverages were sold and consumed illegally. And we've got over here in the corners, we have, somebody who secretly is hauling alcohol. Maybe he has a password or a special knock that allows him into the speakeasy. And then, of course, it's going to be a hidden bar of types. And they could be in office buildings, they were in cellars, they were in tenements or apartment buildings, hardware stores, really anywhere. And so we have a lot of speakeasies during this point in time, illegal bars. And then we also have our next vocabulary term, which is bootleggers or bootlegger. And so this referred to people who smuggled alcoholic beverages into the United States. They're called bootleggers because sometimes they would have hid the alcohol in their boots. But for the most part, you have this massive population within America that really disregards prohibition. And there's some really negative effects that come from prohibition in the sense that I'm going to skip that first one for now. It promotes organized crime. I shouldn't say promotes. It really influences the rise of organized crime. Prohibition generates a level of disrespect for the law. Many Americans felt that prohibition was not something that the government should have done. It wasn't within the government's right to make alcohol illegal. And so you particularly have men like Al Capone in Chicago who capitalizes on this air quote business opportunity. And so you guys are going to be looking at Al Capone later this week on Thursday. But he's going to be somebody, he makes $60 million a year in the sale of illegal liquor. And so, really, what this does is prohibition had some backwards effects on the ideals that they wanted to promote in America. I do want to note, so my first bullet point that I originally skipped, alcohol is still legal for medical and religious purposes. And so rather in a comical sense, prescriptions and sacramental wines, so like wines that you would drink during communion or at church, those sales soar. Many people are buying medical uses of alcohol and sacramental wine for religious purposes as a replacement. All right, so by the mid 1920s, only about 19% of Americans actually supported prohibition. Like I said, there's a lot of pushback with this, and so ultimately it is repealed with the 21st Amendment. But we still endure about 13 years of being more or less alcohol free as a country. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. Just to recap what we've got going on here. So, as a recap, we have Americans isolate themselves after World War One. Americans fear the spread of new political ideas, such as communism. We have in the 1920s a point of superficial wealth. People want to party and they want to forget about the war years, and they're able to get what they want by paying for things on credit, which makes them live these lavish lifestyles. We have a new group of women that are challenging the old identity of women. They're called flappers, and they really take on this scene. And then we have prohibition, which challenges Americans' values. We have things such as speakeasies and bootlegging and organized crime that really rises at this point in time. So this is our first half of looking at this unit. So this week is all about the 20s. When we return from spring break, we're going to be looking at everything to do with the Great Depression. And then, as I mentioned before, you will have a vocabulary test that you can expect on Friday, April 17th. So that's the Friday after we return from break. So I hope this was a helpful presentation for you guys. And I miss you all so much. I wish I could be teaching to you in person, but I hope that you are home and that you are safe and that you are staying sane.